Hello, everyone. I am here with Connie Spence, aka Vegan Batgirl. So she is a vegan lobbyist in Washington, D.C., and today she's going to talk to us about farm subsidies, lobbying, getting involved at a local level, all sorts of fun stuff. So first, Connie, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I was wondering if you could start by telling us about how you got here. How did you first become interested in animal rights, and then kind of how did that lead to you becoming a lobbyist today?
For sure. First, I'll say giving lobbying an overview that it's fun is quite the stretch. It definitely, I want to teach people how it can be fun, but I would assume that the first notion is that politics, like, lobbyists, all of that is not necessarily something that people think of as fun. But it is a duty. And so where the journey began is, I've been vegan for over a decade. I was not an activist to start. I didn't really think about it other than the conversations I was having on a personal level until I started seeing a lot of people on Facebook at the time start grouping together and doing marches, disruptions, you name it. Yeah. And I started my activist journey doing that, but I didn't feel that it fit my personality. I definitely liked meeting people through that activism and felt, I felt like we were making noise and creating awareness, but I never felt like it gave me the opportunity to go into either the data or providing resources or something that like filled more than just like that single conversation. And so I saw like a giant light during like Trump's election where in 2016, someone put a giant light on a wall.
Oh, a literal light. Okay.
Yeah, like a spotlight, like a giant light. And they basically put the words F Trump on the side of a hotel. And at that time, my activism, like at that time, no one really knew what it was. And I was like, you know what? They're basically saying in the article that even though it said F Trump and it was on a hotel, that the police couldn't stop the person because it was legal, because it was light, and light isn't vandalism, and da-da-da-da-da. And I'm like, this is a great way to, basically have an advertisement or, marketing or whatever that tells about something in like the vegan story that you can display on walls. And so I started out doing street activism, and I was like heavy into it. I mean, I would do it 3 or 4 nights a week. Oh, wow. I would do it despite police harassing me or trying to take me out or whatever it was. I'm not kidding. It was like a reality TV show between people trying to steal my equipment to people changing on the spot to police helicopters to police drones to a farmer telling me he's going to throw a pig off a building. I mean, to just like everything you can imagine. And I loved doing it. And I felt really good about it. And I became really good, as many vegans are, at like handling objections, right? The objection cell, if that makes sense, where people are like, well, what about this? And what about this? And I heard this. And you just have to have a plethora of information to be able to handle those objections. And then the point in time it transitioned was right around, I want to say 2017. And I have had a career, I would say, I don't know, I'm getting old. I mean, it's crazy. Like COVID years are like dog years. All of a sudden, 5 years passed and you're like, was that a year ago or was that 5 years ago? But anyways, 5 years ago or something like that, 6 years ago, I started tracking the numbers. So my career has been it started in advertising, and then it went into the data under the hood of advertising, which is just demographics. So think about you and me as a different demographic and how an advertiser would reach us. They're basically collecting information about who I am, whether it's, age, gender, and all of those things. And they're also attaching psychographics to it and all of that. So all of this data over time has become basically like a thumbprint. I mean, it's just tons of data on people. So I never really started out as a data-minded person. My career took me there. And now, you know, over the years, I basically lead data, what's called data acquisition. Through that lens, I started looking at the USDA data, and I started thinking about the big picture and the story that that data was telling. While we were seeing, you know, unicorn stocks and vegan companies go through the roof in regards to how much they were selling in 2017 and 18, while we were seeing Beyond Meat show up at fast food restaurants across the United States, all of these things that felt like huge wins, the story that the data was telling on the USDA side didn't map up. It didn't reflect this huge surge of vegan spending and veganism that should have been saving animals. And since it didn't reflect that, I needed to find out what was going on. And so when I did, I started telling the truth about it, and nobody wanted to hear it, which is that our promise that by going vegan, we're going to save 200 animals or whatever it is, cannot happen under the United States current food system. And it was devastating. But I felt like by telling this, right, that people would be like, okay, so what do we need to do, right? I got attacked like crazy. I was told that I'm hurting the vegan message, that I'm going to prevent someone from going vegan. And the reality is that shouldn't be the case, because you're not anti-racist because there's some return on investment, like, you know, you're anti-racist because it's your moral philosophy and it's ethical. And the same thing with veganism. It's like, it should be saving animals, and we do it so that we pull ourselves away from that machine. But if we find out that it's not, and there's something systemic stopping it, we need to do everything in our power to fix it instead of just ignore it and just act like, you know, nothing's wrong. And so over time, that's where my activism changed. It changed into going down this rabbit hole of food system education, understanding all the policy that's launched in the last, at first it was 100 years, but now it's gone, you know, I think my education and it is like pretty much from the start of the United States on the food system. And then specifically with what is going on in the food system now and laws that basically prevent us from saving animals, prevent losses from on the dairy side and the meat side. And so that's where I've landed now. So my activism, while I am a federal lobbyist now, I still view it as activism. I am doing activism. I'm just doing it with Congress.
Yeah. So. Yeah, well, that's quite a story. I mean, police helicopters and drones and stuff is crazy.
But if I could do that, and to be honest, that's exactly where the fun part comes in.
Oh, yeah.
All those vegans that are literally chaining their necks to conveyor belts or risking their freedom, 100% can be doing this. And after we go through sort of the food system challenges and lobbying, our goal is to incubate vegans to become federal lobbyists and make careers out of it, but not just make a career livelihood out of it, but also do a better job at lobbying because you are so passionate about finding loopholes, because that's really part of what lobbying is. It's not only what you're pitching, it's also about finding like ways in.
Yeah, so let's I want to drill down on something first, because I think probably a lot of the audience doesn't know, and I'm not even that particularly educated on this, but like when you say, like, it sounds like what you're saying is that there's some sort of market interventions or market distortions implemented by the US government because of lobbying. And those interventions are insulating animal agriculture from supply and demand to some degree. What are those specific things? Like, can you give us like an example or some examples?
So the first thing is the dairy industry is a fixed price system. It does not operate by supply and demand. It's been like this since it's been like this before 1949, but a specific law in 1949 made it a fixed pricing system. That means the government decides how much is produced based on which also is a contributing factor of how much they want the farmers to make on the milk at that time. And at this point in time, because dairy has contracts with school systems, dairy has contracts with food banks and beyond, there's a ton of artificial demand. So a lot of that stuff gets thrown out. So regardless if no one buys it, the entire system is fixed anyway. So it is not impacted by sales at all.
Well, so, okay, now I think this is where maybe I have a misunderstanding of this. My understanding with the price fixing was that it gives a substantial buffer, but not that it's like an infinite supply, like that they will cover a percentage of those costs after it breaches some threshold or whatever on the price.
No, so I think you're thinking about like margin coverage perhaps, but the actual system is still fixed. So whatever the back end thing that covers the cost, there's several. So there's there's 4 different things that can cover the cost. So there's dairy checkoff, there's margin protection, there's loss coverage, and there's a 4th, there's other insurance policies. There's I'm freezing right now, but there's like a 4th. So any one of those things can basically close the gap in losses.
Okay. And what is the difference between margin loss and loss protection? What are those two?
Margin loss is based on what that fixed price they set at the beginning of the year. If at the end of the year it's lower, then it covers their losses. So that means that it doesn't matter how much they sell, the loss is covered. That's margin protection. Loss coverage could be from different factors. It could be from environmental factors. It could be from economic factors. It could be from different reasons for loss happening that they can basically submit against.
Okay. And those are like insurance.
So for example, COVID happening, tariffs happening, a bunch of other things that can be covered if a loss occurs that is different from just the margin. And from what we've seen, they can even double up on these, and there's not a lot of guardrails into them not actually double or triple dipping.
Okay, so it sounds like then there are the actual protections themselves and how they sort of should work in spirit. And so you're saying not only is there that, but then there's how it actually works in practice, which oftentimes is not in the spirit of how the subsidies were even created.
Right. So now at this point, it's almost as though dairy is used as a way to be incentivized to produce more and make more money off of it. And so a good way to describe it is any entrepreneur that's trying to sell a product. If you if you want to sell 10 of that product, and year after year, you're only selling 7 of that product, and then someone comes in and says, well, we'll pay for the 3 that you didn't sell, and then you realize that they're never holding you accountable to it. After so many years of saying that you wanted to sell 10 and then making up the difference of the 3, you're going to start selling 15 or acting like you're selling 15, even though, you want to sell 15, even though you still only sold 7. And then you're having the government basically make up the rest. And so that's why you see increases, because nobody's holding them accountable for how many years of losses they've had at all.
Okay. Interesting. And so
supply and demand, just to be clear, to have a supply and demand model to see reductions, you have to feel loss, and they're not feeling any losses. Any losses they have is recouped by all the different programs that keep them safe. And the only ones that are experiencing losses that don't get basically they don't recover from are the small farmers. And so small farmers don't get access to some of these safety programs. And so that's why you see a bunch of small dairy farms failing, but all of that production gets reallocated to the bigger guys.
Yeah, I was reading something about, it was interesting how many farms don't collect subsidies. The number that actually collects subsidies was a small percentage, but of course, I assumed what was happening there is that it's a massive amount of the actual supply just concentrated in the hands of mega farms, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and it was designed that way. I think the shift happened right around the 80s and 90s, and even more so in the 2000s. So, and when I say designed, the head of agriculture during those time periods literally said, like, get big or go home. So now I don't think that they tell small farmers that today because they want to romanticize it, but that's been the common thread, for the last 20 to 40 years.
Okay. Now I've heard that milk tends to be the worst with that, and that they're protected more than other sectors.
Yeah, because of that fixed law. So I would say if anyone wants to research why, it is one of the most challenging. It lives outside of a lot of other food system policies. So the dairy fixed price law in 1949 is a great one to pay attention to. The additional, insurance coverage and loss protection, those are included oftentimes in, different bills, infrastructure bills, the farm bill, right. And usually what you'll see is in those bills, they'll keep expanding how much they can get.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's always like layering on more and more margin help, for example.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. And so we've got a lot of people asking in chat how they can get involved, and I want to get to that in a second.
Okay.
But first, I want to talk about the thing that just happened, which is the Farm Bill. And because that's sort of the first time I heard about you, it was because you had made it into some, I guess, like agricultural magazine as like people to watch out for, in the animal activist movement. And I thought that was interesting. It did seem like a good signal to be like, hey, who is this? If they're worried about her, then maybe we should talk. So if you want to, I don't know, maybe talk about that article a little and kind of what the Farm Bill is and why it's important.
Yeah, the Farm Bill is the Super Bowl of food policy, and every vegan should know about it. Every vegan should do their best to take little steps to understand portions of the Farm Bill. So a little step would be like, when was the first Farm Bill? 1933. Why? It was in response to the Great Depression, right? So those would be the little steps. The steps you take as you really get into it are understanding the titles, what's included in the titles. So there's 12 titles. There's been 18 farm bills since 1933. They happen every 4 to 5 years. It's really about 5 years with an extension at this point. The last farm bill, for example, when weed and hemp was becoming legal, they made an extension so that hemp could have more prominence in that farm bill. Additionally, that was in 2018. This was before, COVID happened. And so they did predict pig diseases because African swine flu, if you've followed that, has been ravaging across the world. And so they added a bunch of funds there for disease mitigation and making sure that, they were trying to make sure that that diseased pigs weren't getting into the United States. And so there was areas of the 2018 Farm Bill that included that as well. But anyways, so this Farm Bill for 2023, it basically think about it as it's a bill that expires and renews. And so it expires in September of 2023, and then it renews. During usually what is about 6 months, a bunch of lobbyists, usually corporate lobbyists, are saying this is what we want in this next Farm Bill. This Farm Bill has been I would say, from what feedback we're getting from Senate offices and House rep offices, is that more people are involved, more social justice groups are involved, awesome. And that people were getting ahead of it way before. So we started, I think, meeting in November, and which in normal cycles would have been considered really early. Everybody was there. The week we were there, the cattle ranchers were there. Oh. So everybody is really hustling right now.
Okay. Wow.
So we still have until September, but I wouldn't look at September as where everyone is right now is submitting their language that they want and trying to get, it's different than sponsorship. You're trying to get a Senate office or more than one, or House rep offices to be like, yeah, we like this language. We'll continue submitting it on your behalf and refining it, to get over the line. And so there's going to be several steps of either including the language, editing, or redlining the language completely out. So the Farm Bill is 800 pages. Think of it as like an 800-page contract legal document. And that is what everybody is redlining meaning editing out, right? Yeah. And inserting, new stuff. They really don't add more funds. And so it's just like reallocating money. They always say they're not adding more funds, but essentially you're expanding programs, inserting new programs, and sort of reallocating money across all the different programs.
Okay. So like what would I guess give us an example of maybe like one or two specific asks that you were asking for in this Farm Bill? Like
sure.
I want X to happen.
The Farm Bill covers nutrition policy, conservation policy. Mm-hmm. It covers the crop insurance, which is such a misnomer because crops aren't, human grade fruits and vegetables aren't even hardly insured. It's mostly, dairy and
like feed crops, basically.
Yeah, soy feed and sorghum. Mm-hmm. But essentially, a great example would be all of the different stuff happening across the United States right now. You have floods, you have droughts, you have disease. All three of these things are getting, different groups are asking for more funding so that these farms don't fail. Obviously, par for course, most of these asks are coming and going to livestock farms and dairy farms or the feed farms. Very little of it goes to consumer fruits and vegetables, which isn't just a vegan thing. I want to be very clear. While we're a vegan group pushing for this, every person you ask who's pissed off that their grocery bill is 30-40% higher, it's not just because of meat. Everything is increased. But nonetheless, so example language could be that, well, not could be. We inserted example language for making sure that there was funding to transition farms when there was issues of disease, drought, floods, or climate change. So a drought or a flood could be just an example of a weather cycle, whereas climate change could be that consistently animals can't survive there. And so what we did is we added language in every opportunity that we found that made sense to transition a farm. And I don't mean just to make sense empathetically and ethically as a vegan, but economical sense. A lot of this is economics. Right. And if we want to stretch the conversation beyond, ethical vegans, the economic side is a huge factor, right? So adding language to transition farms instead of throwing money at them or keeping farmers not farming is a huge ask. I wouldn't say huge ask. It's a logical ask. And so there were many places that we inserted that. Another one that we inserted is to reduce the size of monopolies. And so bailouts and subsidies. So think about how SNAP program is income based. If you make too much money, you don't get access to the SNAP free food. So guess what? If you make too much money as a giant mega dairy farmer or a factory farm, you shouldn't get access to these subsidies and bailouts. So that one is more philosophical, and it's not something that I think will get passed, but I do believe that the transitions will, because they make huge economical sense, and they're not like, something that we'll get too much pushback on. But overall, we need to get public support that basically says the reason everybody's getting screwed, whether they're vegan or meat eaters or both, at the grocery store is because we are giving these mega corporations who are profiting like crazy a free pass because we're giving them access to bailouts that they don't need. Mm-hmm. So it needs to be an income-based model.
Okay. So I guess so just to like sort of summarize that. So you want to so there's a somewhat finite amount of money. You want to try to pull that away from the very large producers who probably don't need the cushion nearly as much, even though they're getting most of it. And
well, they abuse it.
Well, right. And they abuse it. Yeah. And allocate it to other things like instead of protecting an animal farm, transitioning an animal farm. And then even I assume also just offering more protections relatively to fruit and vegetable farmers.
Yeah, so that's a huge one as well. So expanding safety nets, because right now 97% of money goes to livestock and livestock feed. Yeah. And the reality is where we're the stuff we're facing with climate change is not just isolated to livestock and dairy. And again, I don't want to sound like a non-vegan talking and using the words livestock. I don't like using the word, but it is, in the food policy conversation, it is the language. I don't want to minimize, the billions of cows, chickens billions of chickens, millions of cows and pigs that go through what they go through.
Yeah, for sure. And I kind of want to actually go back to that, but I'm sensitive to like the time right now. And so what I want to actually get to now is more like, what are very concrete things? So I've got, a bunch of audience here. A lot of people are saying, wow, I never heard any of this before. This is totally new to me. I don't know anything about it. So like for the audience, for people who are listening to this and hearing it for the first time, what are some like really concrete steps that they can take like after this interview is done and say, okay, I'm going to do X, Y, Z and start kind of getting involved, even if it's just a little bit?
Yeah. So to be clear, I founded a vegan-backed membered lobbying group. It's a federal lobbying group that we have lobbyists in DC that have been pushing for food policy change on our behalf for several years and creating relationships and, also being on not just on the offense, but on the defense as well. It's really important that we are in these spaces where food policy conversations start. So that's first. We are a vegan-backed org, and we only can employ lobbyists if members are, paying monthly, and we totally value our members, but always need more to continue to scale. Beyond that, because this is Farm Bill season, I felt like my best shot and our best shot was coming here and really getting into these spaces. In the past, I felt like leave the lobbyists, they're career lobbyists, we'll just quarterback it in. You look at me, I don't look like a politician. I have tattoos to the everywhere degree. And I think it's super important for us to show up here and take up space, not just for the vegan movement, but overall for who we are as people. If you ever want to see politicians change, I believe they're a mirror of who their lobbyists are and who their all lobbyists look like. So when all the lobbyists look like corporate CEOs, then all the politicians are going to look like an extension of that corporation's boardroom. When we start showing up and looking like this, I'm not just saying looking just like this, but having a diverse set of people here, I believe we're going to see the mirror of politicians reflect back. So we have to be here and we have to grow our political policy side of our movement and our systemic side of our movement. And so with that said of how someone can get involved, we have a vegan voter hub on Agriculture Fairness Alliance. The lobbying org is called agriculturefairnessalliance.org. You can sign up as a member and or as a vegan voter hub person. That allows you to stay in tune with our actions. So when we submitted our Farm Bill asks, those politicians said, well, great, so who supports this? And so then we have to go to our members and our Agriculture Fairness Alliance friends to say, please write to your politicians that you support our asks, right? So that it shows congruency between what we're going in there and saying and what constituents are asking for. And so signing up for the Vegan Voter Hub is really important. We have about 1,700 people on that Vegan Voter Hub. That we should have 10,000. It's so easy. Yes, you have to give your personal information like your address, but that's because your house rep is related not to your zip code, but your address. And we're not using that data for anything other than two things. So one, actions, where you can email your politician, but two, there are occasions where we reach out to a Voter Hub member to join a politician call when they want to hear from them. And so anyways, joining the Vegan Voter Hub. The third is keep an eye out for a future project that we're going to do. We are going to launch a lobbying incubation project where we believe that whether you're 17 years old and about to have your 18th birthday and maybe don't think college is right for you, or maybe can't afford it, or maybe you can afford it but just think that it doesn't make sense in the current environment. We want to incubate people that have the passion and the ability to do what you do on the street, which is deal with objections, have a ton of resources and data, and come here and learn how to write legislation, how to research it, how to host and have a meeting and present, and just really understand the whole space, so that as we're incubating people to basically have the tools that they need to become a lobbyist, we grow the movement here. So that big ag and big corporations aren't the only ones running around in DC.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Then I think you wanted to know some things about local. There's a lot of great things you can do local. So in the federal realm, you have to work with a federal lobbyist, and that federal lobbyist has to be tied back to a lobbying organization. Can you ride along with someone else's lobbyist? Yes, but there's tracking stuff that happens federally that makes it better to go through lobbyists, because that's the language that a lot of the politicians know
sorry. Yeah. So when you say, I'm a person and I'm like, hey, I want to do vegan lobbying, and I'm not yet a lobbyist. I go and I find a lobbyist who's a representative. How does that work?
You wouldn't be able to federally. It just would be challenging. You could reach out to try to set up meetings, but but those politicians can't accept money, or there's other ethical stuff that they can't do. That's why they need a trackable federal lobbyist. I am tracked through a federal database.
So you're registered in some way.
Yeah, exactly.
I see. Okay.
And I'm attached to Agriculture Fairness Alliance, who's also registered as a lobbying organization.
Okay.
So it will be challenging. Could you do it? Yeah. Sure. It'd be challenging, and a lot of those politicians won't do it, because it's important for them to make sure that their money or their who's in their offices and they're agreeing to meet with and take opinions of, track back to something.
I see.
On a state level, though, and especially local level, you can physically create these meetings and go directly and talk to those politicians. So when you think about local level, city council, mayor, all of that, you absolutely can centralize people and meet and let them know what you feel. But I do think the biggest clincher that the movement doesn't have is the ability to understand how to write legislation. And that's part of our incubation process that we want to launch, where we create templatized legislation that essentially can be used throughout the movement, and so that we can multiply our ability to go at different angles. On the state side, with governors and state reps, additionally, you don't necessarily need a lobbyist, but it could be difficult to get a meeting, because again, you have to understand that those politicians' they don't have time to meet with every individual. So when they're meeting with a lobbyist who represents a lot of people, it's much easier for them to manage their schedule that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so then just kind of to summarize that, then I'm hearing from sort of simplest to most difficult. So sort of the simpler things you can do are probably immediately go to that Vegan Voter Hub, get registered there. Check out AFA. You can also donate to you guys. And both of those links should be in the description for this video. So if you scroll to the bottom, you should see one specifically for Vegan Voter Hub and one for AFA.
So I just changed the Voter Hub link to an acronym of the VVH.
Okay.
Wait, it's agriculturefairnessalliance.org/VVH. I just changed that. So
okay, because I just put them in today. So unless you just changed it,
you might have it right.
I might have gotten it. I'll check though, and I'll update them if it's wrong. So those are kind of like the two easiest ones.
In Chrome or anywhere for Vegan Voter Hub, it's the only one that pops up.
Okay, so it's easy to find.
Yeah, it's easy to find.
Okay, so then going a little bit more in depth would be getting involved in local politics, either trying to grab a meeting with the mayor, the city council. And so actually I listened to one of your other podcasts, and I'm actually going to try to start going to city council meetings, a couple of us. Yeah, and so I want to put together like a presentation and stuff. So I think that's going to be my next step.
But I think after you do that, you're going to feel as though there's not a thing for you to get signed or pushed in. That's where the legislation piece is that I'm saying that I think that, and this is where AFA, we could do a lot of things. We just have to scale with donations. So there's a lot of things that are sort of waiting, to scale. Right now, our focus is fully on the Farm Bill, but helping groups locally with legislation and writing it, I would love to be able to templatize, because that's how, when you see laws spreading across the United States, that's how it's done. So when you see abortion laws, just all these states all of a sudden having the laws, it's because one group wrote one template legislation and handed it to their local groups. Right. And so we need to be copying that, not copying. We literally need to be doing the same thing.
Yeah. It's like no reason to reinvent the wheel over and over.
And you're going to pay someone who's non-vegan to write your legislation a lot of money, right? That may not even get it right, or may not have, the background of what another state might have had to deal with, for example. Yeah.
And I think that's like one thing here is that, like, I think with a lot of with outreach activism, there's so many YouTube videos, so many examples, so many things like that anyone can kind of go in there and kind of start to understand how to do outreach. But there's very, very little templates or examples of how do I become a lobbyist, how do I write legislation, how do I talk to my city council and things like that. And I think I'm really excited to hear that you're going to be doing something like that to make it a little more cookie cutter, or at least some sort of skeleton that then people can adapt to their local environment or whatever. So I think that's really exciting.
We want to see the paradigm of activism shift from just thinking that it's street activism and protesting, and more of this proactive systemic stuff. I am doing activism right now, whether people think it or not. Like this to me is activism.
Oh yeah. Well, I have a very, very wide definition of activism. So I consider almost everything activism as long as you're doing it in service of the animals. But yeah, so I think that's cool. So then it sounds like you're going to have a program coming out sometime soon. That's sort of, you're calling it an incubation program, kind of like a teaching program, sort of getting people off the ground with how to work, which is great. And I think that was like everything you said. So yeah, that's a lot of stuff. I mean, that's a lot of things that people can sort of sink their teeth into right now. Just to remind everyone, Vegan Voter Hub again, and AFA, and those links should be in the description of this video. So definitely get registered on Vegan Voter Hub if you do nothing else.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I want to ask you a couple of other things then. As far as language goes, because you're talking about language.
My favorite color is purple.
Oh, okay. That's my favorite color too, actually.
It is my favorite color. But I'm like in this mint green. I was joking because you said you had more questions, and I was like throwing in my favorite color and all that.
But it's really mint green now? You lied to me?
No, I have this mint. I don't know what's going on, but everything I'm buying is mint green right now. I'm just into I just moved, so I have to, get new this and whatever. And so I'm just, even if I can find a mint green vacuum, it's mint green toaster.
Is mint green, is that like the hotness in DC right now? It's just like a DC trend?
I don't know where it came from. I'm obsessed with mint green. My handlebars on my bike are mint green. The tape is mint green. Yeah.
Wow.
So I love purple, but I'm on a mint green thing right now.
green is more aesthetically, like thematically relevant to veganism, I guess. So it makes
Very
sense.
true. That's true.
But yeah, like you're talking about language earlier, and I know as someone who works in the corporate world, now I guess you worked in the corporate world prior to this also, but language tends to be like very, very important whenever you're entering a new sort of space that has like its own jargon and its own ways of being and stuff. And I wonder how that language, like how that shift was to adapt to, I guess, because I imagine the corporate world is still slightly different from the sort of political world in some ways. And I think you even said kind of how, maybe I was watching this in an interview, how sometimes, especially at the federal level, you have to be less animal rights forward and kind of like sell it to them in other ways, like sell it to them on the economic fronts and things like that to get these things passed.
I mean, so you have to think about it. So there are a lot of synergies to corporate in the sense of you're creating relationships. So let's say you're a salesperson for technology or salesperson for office furniture. You have to create relationships. You have to network. You have to land the meeting. When you get to the meeting, you have to basically figure out what it is that person values. So the reason I say you can't be as animal centric, those people don't value animals. So if you're going to try to make them value animals, you're going to spend 3 meetings and they might reject you on the second and third to get them to care about animals. So you have to figure out what they care about. They do care about the economic part. They do, or at least they act like they do. They do care about farmers keeping on farming, or at least the idea of it. So that's more of what I'm saying. What I don't want us to think is we can't be authentic. We are really authentic. There was a time period where I had an executive director who had a different opinion about being authentic, and I pushed back hard. I think we do go in there and tell them we're vegans. We're very open about telling them we're vegans. So I don't want it to sound like I'm trying to keep us in like this hidden, space of who we are. We don't call ourselves plant-based. We call ourselves vegans, and the story that vegans are trying to make the food system better, keep farmers farming, give them a good livelihood through plant-based farming, decrease the cost of everybody's grocery bill, right? All of those things are great stories to tell that vegans are trying to do. So we're very open about being vegan, but my point is, just like if you're selling technology or furniture, you have to sell to what that person or group of people are ultimately challenged with or looking for. And so when they're not challenged or looking for animal-centric policies and they don't care about them, especially those who control the food system on the Republican red state side, you can't force something that is going to take longer to get them to care about the animal than to get the policy that effectively still saves or protects the animal. Yeah, you're reaching the same destination. So it's just strategic. And I guess it's strategic, and it's important because you'll get kicked out of those offices if you try to force something any other way, right?
Do you find that it's easier to talk to or persuade Democrats versus Republicans? Do you notice any major differences there?
Well, we don't go as hard with Democrats because getting Democrats on our side is more of a given. And if many Democrats are on the side, on the federal level, too many Democrats on the side, Republicans will not want to.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's so. So we actually approach more Republicans than anyone. Right.
Interesting.
And that's because if you get Republicans on your side, then naturally the Democrats will come. And that is based on food policy. That's why it's really important to know and watch what happens, with someone like Cory Booker's legislation, all that legislation he introduces. It's great. A lot of it's fantastic. But why are Republicans not getting on board with it? It literally is because the vegan Democrat proposed it or sponsoring it.
Okay, so you think there's some tribalism, like some just straight up politics there that have nothing to do with whether or not they think it's a good idea.
For sure.
Okay.
Whether or not it's economics. So that's why you have to diversify. I think his stuff is great. I think supporting it is great, but you have to diversify, and you have to get the Republicans, who again are the ones who control a lot of the food system and everything, on board. And I don't want to discount the fact that California has a giant amount of the food system in it, you know, and also that's a great example of something that, you know, California is the largest dairy state, and it is super liberal and super progressive. So, you know, we still need to be able to diversify how we look at the food system overall, and even Democrat states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And well, I guess you kind of answered this, because I was going to say, do you go in with different strategies talking to a Republican versus a Democrat?
Every time.
Okay.
I look at Democrat or Republican, I look and see if they were born on a farm. A lot of them are. I mean, literally, that's what I was saying, the mirror. Mm-hmm. The mirror is like an extension of the dairy farm's boardroom or family members. That's how it feels like sometimes. And so you have to figure out like how tied to the industry they are. Were they inserted there, right? Yeah. And it's a natural insertion. I know we don't like seeing that, but what do you think is going to happen if we were to get really large? We would insert our own into agriculture committees and into politics. And that's actually a great segue to, if there's no reason that a great activist, someone who's amazing on the bullhorn, who speaks at speaking events, there's no reason you aren't running for a city council position or higher. A lot of times House rep positions and more, you know, they do have some age restrictions, but like city council, in many places you can be 18 years old to be on the city council.
Oh, wow.
And you could be making $60,000 a year, which for, I think.
Damn, really?
Yeah, I'm telling you. Wow. So
it's a good salary for an 18-year-old.
For sure. So I get this whole idea that why are these laws happening? These people are so much older than us and this and that. It's like, well, it's because we're not getting involved, and a lot of it is the same sort of maybe life cycle, right? So it's like in our 20s we're protesting, in our 30s we're sort of trying to figure out how to settle down in life, and in our 40s we're like, hey, some of this stuff's not working, maybe we need to get involved in politics. So you know, so then once people get involved in politics, then you start seeing people look like that age range. So people need to start getting involved much earlier.
Yeah, that's good advice. I mean, I feel like I've gone through that life cycle myself. It's like when I was 18, I could give two shits about politics. You know what I mean? Like that wasn't even in my on my radar at all. So, but now, of course,
I could have given two shits about it like 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Like, we have to. I guess it's a saying. Like we have to.
Yeah, for sure. That's funny. What like, I guess, you know, because I guess you're still somewhat new. Well, certainly you're new to actually being in Washington now, but like, I guess what were some surprises that you had about being a lobbyist and getting involved in Washington and stuff?
That I'd be totally listened to and like by Republicans, and that I'd be welcome in there, and that my ideas and our ideas as a lobbying organization were taken serious. I had stayed away, and and again, the opinion that I got from even some volunteers and people that were part of AFA before was that I was causing problems with Republican politicians because I was too vocal. I was too like calling people out and all of that stuff. I was told to temper my authentic self down. And it made me really insecure about what I felt like I needed to do, but what I was getting feedback on, right? So I was thinking in my head, like, again, just stay behind the scenes. You have the data tell the story, hand the strategy and data a lot of times to the lobbyists. And then I want to say September of last year, I was like, you know what? I want to go to DC in person. I've had Zoom calls with them. I've been under the hood. I'm super keyed into everything minus the in-person stuff. And so when I went, it was a blow your mind moment. I purposely, like, I could have dressed in turtlenecks and covered, and I purposely said, you know what? I'm going to be authentic. I'm going to roll up my sleeves. I'm going to
literally roll up your sleeves and show your tats.
Literally, yeah. I wanted all of who I was to be completely obvious. And when I went there, I realized like I was owning the meeting. Our lobbyists set up the meeting, but I was pulling out the laptop, showing the data There are moments when our lobbyist would, an objection would happen, and our lobbyist would nod and say, yeah, I guess I could see how much, control, the meat packers have. And my response was, well, that sounds more like favoritism. Like, I asked the politician, are you saying that you don't care about your fruit and vegetable farmers then? Oh, no, I'm not saying that at all. Right.
Yeah.
And then getting a next step. And I'm like, in that moment, I'm realizing like those loopholes of like, I got to make it happen are different when you're vegan. They're just different when you have what feels like something to really lose. And then when I was waiting outside, Washington, D.C. is a very diverse population, and a good majority of the people who work all along these politician offices are Black, and all the politicians are white. And especially when you see like racist politicians, it's a really interesting place. And these buildings are named after KKK members. No kidding. KKK politicians from the past. And when I was outside, a Capitol Police came up to me, and he was like, who are you? And I thought he was interrogating me. And I'm like, oh, here we go with like, you just don't look like you belong here. And he said, why are you here? And I was explaining, I'm here with my lobbyist. I was pointing at the white lobbyist over there, right? Like that are clean cut. And he's like, are you a lobbyist? And at the time I wasn't. I was like, I was a founder of a lobbying group. And he's like, we never see people like you in here. And when he said that, and he was like, we basically was communicating that we need to see more people like you here.
Oh, this was like he was happy about it. He wasn't like coming to.
Yeah, okay. At first it didn't seem that way, but that's my point. That was the moment I realized, oh my God, like he's absolutely right. Everybody who works for these people want to see us in here. And he said all he sees is cowboys walking in and out of those doors. Oh, no. And then that's when it was like, well, that's why cowboys are getting their way, because they're the ones here walking through those doors. So vegans need to be here walking through those doors. So that was the big aha moment. And so since September of last year, it turned into me coming again 2 more times and seeing the next steps play out much faster than they ever had before. And then this whole, I need to move here to give it my best shot. And now not only give it our best shot, but I want to empower the vegan movement to doing the same, because if I can do it, like anybody can do it.
That's interesting. It's like, it's funny because it's almost like you're going to get more bang for your buck at the federal level to begin with, but then also they're probably going to be more amenable to diverse individuals there than in a lot of people's hometowns or small cities and things like that.
So that's actually really interesting that you say that. So think of a House rep, specifically. House reps have their districts. I agree that I believe, and I don't know this for a fact, if you were to meet with a rural House rep or try to in the hometown where they have the ability to have bias, they're going to have that bias there. They're not going to do it in front of their peers in DC.
Oh, so they get checked in DC, basically, is what you're saying.
I think that they would get checked. I think they would get checked more.
Okay, interesting. That's interesting. That's an interesting insight. Huh. Okay. Well, I'm happy that that person came up to you and was like, "Hey, I'm happy you're here." I'm sure that was a very like empowering moment for you.
He thought I was the most important person on the planet because I was there, and that's why I'm saying, like, he couldn't believe, like, he was like, "Who are you?" I was thinking I was getting interrogated. He was like, "Who are you?" Because he felt like I was so important, and I was like, "We're just a small, grassroots lobbying group," and it's like. But to that point, it was in that moment where it was like, we have to be taking up space here. Like the whole country wants us to be taking up space. Again, not just from a vegan perspective, from everything, from human rights, from everything. Those corporate extensions of the boardroom, the politicians are abusing our taxes, not just in the food system, in every way. Consumers are not getting anything back for how much taxes we put in. It's just getting allocated to to make corporations make more and more profit that is basically coming off of our labor.
Right.
And so in the food system and period, to change society, to create a more equitable society, we have to be in these spaces.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. What else I want to ask you? I want to ask you, like, what do you think are some like mistakes that you made that, for like maybe people coming up and getting into this for the first time, maybe some pitfalls that they could watch out for?
The whole idea, again, like listening to people, that my outspokenness was ruining things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
You really have to understand that if what you're speaking out against is ethical, that you don't need to silence yourself. Do you perhaps need to package it in a different format? Perhaps.
Yeah.
But specifically on your social media, specifically on, in your speaking events, you do not have to, unless you're abusing people, you do not have to temper who you are. And that was, I think, if I hadn't done that and I had believed in my authenticity more so years ago, I would have been a lobbyist here in DC years ago. And I would have, we would have been, not that I'm regretting anything, but, perhaps we would have 10 vegan lobbyists in DC at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think as vegans, we know this, and throughout history too. It's like typically when people are telling you that you shouldn't be so outspoken and that it's hurting you in the movement, we basically know that's always bullshit, and that's just a sign that we should probably continue to be outspoken, maybe even more so. So yeah,
and being on that magazine of like what to look out for, I think they're more scared of me not because I play the part of a lobbyist, but because I am a relatable, like, public person that is pushing myself into a space that felt like there was some sort of like barrier to.
You think there's going to be like almost like a broader message that is sent? It's not just that vegans can get in here. It's that like we are welcoming to like a larger group of people, and that could open like the floodgates, in other words. It's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, just that we could flip policy across the board, and that people are always othering lobbyists. Every time you see a social media post about lobbyists, people always talk about lobbyists like they are the government. And lobbyists literally are just making a paycheck to do whatever the lobbying group is trying to get them to do. It's not lobbyists. It's basically who hires them. And there's no restriction for the public to have just as many or more lobbyists in DC. The public we started lobbying. The very first lobbyists were the public sitting outside of the offices of politicians. And it was that way until the 70s. In the 70s, a Supreme Court justice created a memorandum that basically went out to the Fortune 1000 companies at the time, think GM for cars and on those types of companies, and changed the paradigm for them, saying, imagine what we could get if, in the favor of the United States public, if we started lobbying. They saw such a good return on investment, and they, at the same time that they started increasing their lobbying presence, the public, I guess, after the civil rights movement, sort of felt like, there was a win, and they, maybe the fight was something that they didn't have to do. And you started seeing the unions and the lobbying groups that people used to centralize with sort of temper off. Additionally, from the 70s to 80s, there was a lot of deregulation. There was a lot of union busting stuff. And so the centralization of the public has dwindled down to extreme degrees. So every problem we have in society is a mixture of two things. It's the decentralization of the public. While we centralize on social media, we don't centralize in lobbying and unions. And on the other side of it is the monopolization of corporations. Those are the biggest problems in society. They reflect upon the food system and everything else that we hate happening. Whether it's us thinking we should have a 4-day work week or more vacation
we definitely
days.
Should. We definitely need a 4-day work week.
But that happens through lobbying. And if we had unions if every one of us was in our own, union as we were in the, 30s to 60s, we absolutely would have a 4-day work week.
Damn, that'd be nice. That'd be nice. So I appreciate that we're kind of coming up towards the end of the time here. I'm just going to put this out, and obviously you don't have to answer any questions if you don't want to. But if people want to ask questions, you want to send in super chats or whatever, just send those in now. And if there's anything to ask, if you want to ask me something, you want to ask Connie something, go ahead. And in the meantime, while people do that, I did want to ask you one final question, and this might not be something you're super familiar with, but my audience is obviously an international audience, right? And this entire time we've been talking very much about the US. Do you know much about like how people can get involved otherwise? If they're in other countries, maybe even big countries like Canada, UK, or anything like that?
Yeah. So first off, the United States Farm Bill is one of the largest food policy bills in the world and it ends up being a global policy. So there are a lot of effects that happen. Other countries oftentimes mirror what the United States does and how we pull in money. Now, the bad thing about the United States and the good thing about other countries is you don't have out of control lobbying. A lot of times there's restrictions. There isn't as much like, I think there's transparency on how much money a lobbying group or an advocacy group can give to politicians. There's more of the, accountability to make sure corruption isn't happening, and that doesn't exist here. So the good news is that I believe in other countries, if you get involved in policy, that you're not going to have to deal with with sort of like the wild, wild west of just no accountability with the amount of money that lobbyists funnel into politicians. When it comes to, people internationally, I would suggest finding ways to understand how to submit legislation. So, and what I mean by that is like, what is that country's specific process? Do you have to have a lobbyist, or do you just have to have well-written legislation and a good relationship, right? And that would be like one of the first steps that I would take. And again, you can look at it from a local lens, a state or province lens, or a national lens. A lot of westernized countries have very similar insurance policies and other stuff that the United States does. So Canada is a great example that's going to have several things that mimic the United States. The UK also. Some things to look out for in other countries is how do you get more of your either taxes or money to make fruits and vegetables more accessible. And then if there's not some sort of dairy system in the country that is rigging supply and demand, create legislation to prevent it from happening.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. Okay. Awesome. All good tips. I don't think it looks like we do have one question.
I would say international people can always share our work, because what I've seen on Instagram algorithms is sometimes you'll see your international friends post more than even local friends, to which they can amplify through their US, connections, what we do, and whether it's, membership or the voter hub.
Okay, awesome. All right, so it looks like we got one question here, maybe, from Yerable. What incentives do these politicians have to actually listen to you? The image I have that lobbyists just give envelopes full of cash in exchange for the bills to be signed.
Well, again, if you're really trying to figure out what motivates that politician, so yes, some of them it's just money, and some of them again are inserts. And that's actually something we're working on our lobbyists to understand in the agriculture committee, like who is just a waste of time because they are absolutely an insert. Not all of them are that way. And again, if a politician overall is looking to get reelected, and while that money is important, the voting from people that are in their district or state is also important. So by centralizing people who believe in the same thing and making that noise, and also voting either for them and saying, hey, this policy change, if you do it, like, here are these votes to make sure you're reelected, is also important. So I guess the point is like, at some point, if we were to grow, would we grow into like a super PAC that additionally helps with funding for someone to get reelected? And let me just be clear. Funding to be reelected doesn't always have to be like, corrupt. The cost for even local people to get elected and how much media cost for their, for them to be known is very expensive. And lobbyists can contribute to money that basically helps them get reelected in that manner. So I guess to answer that question is, yes, there's a lot of what you think with the corruption and here's just a bag of money. They can't legally bribe in that way. But also getting reelected is expensive. And so there are ways to do it, in a way that is a negotiation. You are helping them get reelected in multiple ways between your voters and helping fund, their campaigning or their media. And they're going to scratch your back if they win that election.
Okay. Tips.
But our org isn't set up to, could we be in the future? Yes, but we're not set up in the way to endorse a candidate or to spend money like that on one.
Okay. Good to
know.
So
ours is much more legislation advocacy meeting with them.
Okay. There was, I think, one other question that it just says this: please talk about unpaid farm workers who put food on your plate, who have the lowest rights, practically legal slavery and child labor. I don't know if that's
Yeah, so that's actually a terrible thing across the world, but most definitely here, which is like indentured servitude. Mm-hmm. So when you dig deep into the food system, you hear things that you're not sure are true. And I don't want to make it sound like conspiracy theories or rabbit hole stuff, but I'm going to point out one of them. Mm-hmm. One of the things I've heard is that there is a train that goes from Central America through Mexico and literally drops people off in certain rural areas on farms. I don't know if that's true or not, but the point is that there's almost like a recruitment of people who aren't going to the border and crossing the border to be in Ohio, mm-hmm. right? That there's literally a train that brings them there. I don't know how much of that is true, but the point is that there are many immigrants, whether you want to call some of them undocumented or some documented, because H-2A is a farm program that technically makes them documented. The indentured servitude in the United States is one of the largest human trafficking that we have in the U.S., and people don't even realize that. Additionally, there's rules that those H-2A workers can allow their kids to work. And so I have arguments with people online oftentimes about this, which is that our child labor laws don't technically cover non-citizen kids. Now, you'll hear people say that it does, but there's many articles that say that it technically doesn't spell it out. And so it's almost like that is a consistent thing that you're going to see grow more and more. So it's not just, oh, let's make it legal for a 16-year-old to work at a slaughterhouse or at a factory farm or wherever. It's additionally that those H-2A workers or even undocumented workers who have kids, that labor is something that is desired. And it's because there's these loopholes, there's nobody tracking them, they're getting paid like hardly anything, and it's super dangerous. And so those types of things are on my radar, And I absolutely would like to scale to the point of changing that, because I believe that when you're trafficking these kids for labor and creating the oppression and control, that many other terrible things are happening to them. And I think that none of that should be connected to our food system. And that doesn't just exist in livestock and dairy. There's some of that obviously with plant-based foods as well. But keep in mind, there's two things that we need to keep in mind. One is industrialized agriculture doesn't exist because of vegans. Industrialized agriculture exists because the recipe was created for livestock farming. And so that recipe sort of maintained, with produce production. So if we are to get more in control of the system, we absolutely want to make it a more ethical system and ensure that stuff doesn't happen. The second thing is that when
I won't eat anything that casts
thinking about labels, right? People have talked about ethical palm oil, right? An ethical palm oil label. Or I'm even thinking about an ethical soy label, because I don't want to buy soy from those mega soy groups that are basically their number one priority is livestock. I want a completely autonomous, separate soy farmer to buy soy from. Otherwise, I don't want to buy soy because I'm just elevating, right?
Yeah.
But anyways, labels. So a label, like, we should be considering is decoupling the industrialized agriculture from fruit and vegetable farming to make sure that, we might be spending more, but we're making sure that it's not coming from those types of trafficking farms. Lastly, that the policy, right? You can always create policy to try to change that. I wish I could be in 100 places at once, because that is a big deal to me. And it's just atrocious, right? When you see the injuries, the deaths, and again, the abuse that they go through, physical and downstream, because again, they're really in, their lives are completely controlled. It's terrible.
For sure. Yeah. It's messed up. Okay.
Does that help answer that? I mean, I know
it was a pretty comprehensive answer, I think, for their question. I mean, they just said talk about, so it wasn't really a specific question so much. So I think that was probably a good answer for them, I'd say.
I mean, since our labor laws seem to not spell out undocumented kids, that's an example of it needs to, right? We need to change that. Our child labor laws should protect any child, regardless of where they're born or why they're here.
Awesome. Okay, so we do have one super chat here from someone.
Okay.
So slightly more off topic, but is asking people to reduce their consumption of animal food products a legitimate way to approach saving animal lives? So I was asking someone to just reduce consumption. Is that
for
legitimate?
Sure. But you can't stop there, right? It's like the first step is to help them understand the impacts of animal agriculture. It's so terribly abusive on animals. It is so terribly abusive on all of our resources. We are literally letting an industry broker off our land and our health. And I don't mean just health from eating. The CO2 measurements in the United States and China are the worst in the world. And that affects our air, it affects our soil. It degrades the fruit and vegetable nutrients when you have high CO2. So your nutrient density of your food even is reducing because of how terrible the agriculture industry is with brokering off all your land and resources to feed you and everybody else. Now, so there's a bunch of check boxes to give someone and say, reduce or stop eating these animals, because you're basically paying for really terrible people to be in control of our food system and just allow terrible things to happen. Now, how do you make sure that animals are getting saved is that next step, which is, now that you're vegan, we have to understand the systemic blocks and barriers, and we have to, dismantle those. And so, every time vegans are meeting, we should be talking about not just how to turn someone vegan, but how to actualize saving animals. So yeah, going vegan is 100% the first step, but we can't just focus on consumerism to save animals, because it's not. And of course it's not, right? Like, it's consumerism.
Okay, awesome. So, okay, I think that was the last question, and I have to get out of here soon. So I want to say, Connie, thank you for coming on. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I think the audience learned a lot of things. And so just to remind everyone, if you do want to get involved, remember that Vegan Voter Hub is in the description, as well as the link to AFA. And then keep your eye out for the incubation program, which is like a teaching program for I guess developing.
Please share our stuff.
Lobbyists.
We only have like 4,700 Instagram followers, which everyone who comes on there is like, I don't understand how you don't have more. I don't either. But, we need your help to, spread the message, because we are here on the ground in DC.
Yeah, and sorry, I should mention that too. So AFA has an Instagram, and you also have an Instagram, and your Instagram I think is just Vegan Batgirl. And
vegan _Batgirl.
Vegan _Batgirl. Okay.
But my authenticity, again, is outspoken. So you're going to hear me talk about police brutality, all that stuff. So if you want to stick to animal-centric, anti-oppression, stuff, that's on the agriculturefairnessalliance.org. If you want authentic Connie...
Mint green Connie. If you want mint green Connie, then
yeah,
you have to check out Vegan Batgirl. Okay, well, awesome. Yeah. So like I said, thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciated this, and I think everyone learned a lot. So,
awesome. It was great to talk. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.